Well, it's been about 2 months since the free-to-play DPS ranking, so considering Lingsha just came out and Rap is the only character coming out in 2.6, I think now's a safe time to do a support ranking, which obviously will include all buffers, debuffers, and sustainers. Now, the one thing I need to stress and preface before everything is that this is a free-to-play investment tier list, so if you're wondering what that means, first of all characters here E0, S0 when we're judging their strength, and instead of ranking them by how strong they are, we're instead looking at how worth it they are at investing into, including building them and pulling them. And of course part of this will include how strong they are, but also how versatile and flexible they are, as well as how much competition they face since free players have limited resources and have to prioritize who they pull for, and shouldn't pull for characters which there are cheaper alternatives for. So yeah, I hope that makes sense, and we can get started. And also, if you bring your mind back to the DPS ranking, that went from S to F tier. However, this one doesn't actually have an F tier, since I don't think there's actually any horrible supports in the game, and I think most of them have at least one use case, which is why the ranking is more inflated in here than the DPS list, and also we are also considering 5 stars, which is why we're only ranking the units you can see from the top from Bailu to Lingsha. With that being said, going in order of release, the first character will be Bailu, and unfortunately for Bailu, she will end up having to be our lowest ranking, although she's actually not going to be going in the D tier, since I actually don't think there's any D tier support in the game. We're actually going from the C tier. Now, she's not even the lowest just because I think she's horrible or something, because I mean, really she's not that bad of a sustain. The problem here is that there's just already so many good sustainers of preservation and abundance, and there's also 4 stars you would use over her. I mean, the most obvious one would be Gallagher, since he's just such a strong sustainer and also so strong in break teams, but even someone like Lynx can be better than Bailu in like Blade teams or Yunli teams, so there's not really a spot in the meta for Bailu. Even though she's an okay healer, the lack of cleanse does kind of murder her. So since there's not really a team where Bailu belongs, and there's also 4-star units who can do what she does but better, she's going in the C tier. Now time for our other standard balance sustain is going to be Gepard, and Gepard's actually going to be up in the B tier, and that's mostly because honestly, he's just a pretty decent sustainer. And I mean, considering the fact that he's only one of 2 team-wide shielders, that kind of does help his ranking out a bit, because his only real competition is Aventurine. Obviously Xuan is also a preservation unit, but she functions slightly differently. And I mean, he's also viable in like most teams just because he's just like an okay sustain. I mean, he can even use like the trend icon and be pretty damn good in Akron teams. Overall, he's just a pretty decent sustain, and the reason why I have him higher than Bailu is just because people tend to favor shields more, since it means that you won't get one shot, even though Bailu does have a revive that only works once. So I think most people just agree Gepard is a slightly better sustainer than Bailu, which is why I put him slightly above her. But now for the final standard character we are going to be ranking, it is going to be Bronya, who obviously was the best 5-star buffer for a long time in the game, until 1.6 when Ruan Mei released, so obviously back in the day she'd be back up here. But nowadays, I'd say probably around the A tier. I mean, she has taken a bit of a backseat because after Ruan Mei, they released like 2 more 5-star harmonies in Sparkle and Robin in the next 3 versions, so she's definitely not as high as she used to be, but I'd say A tier is still pretty decent, because I mean, she's still a very useful unit. I mean, most of her uses are with older units like Zila, Blade, Jingliu, but she's also good with modern units like Boot Hill, since the Boot Hill Ruan Mei Gallagher team is still very good to this day. And I mean, she has some teams where she functions better in than Sparkle, who's supposed to be an upgrade on her, so yeah, I think Bronya is fair enough to be in the A tier. She's pretty easy to build, pretty free-to-play friendly. Then of course you can get her Lycon from the store or the standard banner, and you'll probably get Eidolons for her from the standard banner or from losing her 50/50s, so I'd say eventually you will find a use for Bronya, which is why I would actually quite recommend building her, either for a character you already own, or one which will come out in the future, and she basically only gets better with time since you're gonna keep getting upgrades for her. But with that being said, we are finally onto our first limited character, and that's going to be Luocha, coming out in version 1.1. Now, as much as I love Luocha, I am going to be putting him in the B tier. I mean, I personally pulled for him as my only limited healer, which means no Huohuo or Lingsha for me. And it was actually on his rerun when people were already saying that he fell off, which, if I'm being honest, he is definitely the worst of the limited sustains. And I mean, even Gallagher can outshine him in some situations, whether it be his healing or just his damage output in break teams, which is why he's in the B tier, since he just has so much competition. But I wouldn't put him in the C tier, just because he does have a cleanse. He's still very good in some teams like Jingliu or Blade, thanks to him having a cleanse, as well as being very SP positive. So yeah, he definitely has a lot of uses. He does a very good job of keeping your team alive, since his heals are absolutely insane. But unfortunately, you can't increase your max HP using Luocha, so you might get one shot sometimes or be really close to death, which is why unfortunately he is going to have to be in the B tier. And now for our other version 1.1 sustain, it's going to be a Silverwolf, who is going to top off our B tier placement. Now again, I love Silverwolf, I still use her to this day, but I just can't put her above the beta, since she does have some issues at E0, S0, which is what we are looking at. First of all, if you don't have the version 1.1 event icon, then you're not going to have full uptime on her defense shred unless you pull her E1, which we're not considering here, since you'll only be getting a 4-turn ult, which can be problematic, especially with the fact that they're adding faster enemies in the game nowadays, such as Huohuo, which means that your defense shred uptime will not be the greatest. And also the fact that modern DPS like Acheron, Feishao, Firefly, and Bootle can all either implant a weakness or ignore weaknesses kind of makes Silverwolf's weakness implant not that great, since you're not even guaranteed to get the element you want unless you carefully craft your team around it. And yeah, while she still sees a lot of use in something like Apoc Shadow or Memory of Chaos, it is slowly being less. And she also doesn't really have one team in which she specializes in other than Mono Quantum. And there's also competition in the form of the likes of Jiaoqiu, who's very good for Acheron, which is his specific niche, and then he's just a good general debuffer. And then obviously also Palo, who is a 4-star, so unfortunately Silverwolf is going to have to be in the B tier. But with that being said, it's time to move on to Xuan, who is actually going to be our first S tier character. I mean, she's a very good sustainer thanks to her damage reduction, as well as her crowd control prevention, and she can even increase the damage thanks to her crit rate increase. Now, your units will sometimes go down just because there's so much damage going on, or maybe skill points can be an issue, which means you can't prevent certain crowd controls, but overall, she's still a very good sustain with decent utility that can be played in almost any team, and can even hold trend for Acheron. So, you know, she's just a good generalist sustainer. I mean, the only reason why she's not in the SS tier is simply because she doesn't really have a niche in which she's amazing in. Think about some other sustainers, whether it's follow-up or break, which is their niche in which they're very good in. Xuan doesn't really have that outside of Mono Quantum. She's just a good generalist sustainer, where if you have her, you probably don't need to pull another, but maybe she shouldn't be your first choice to pull. And because of that, she's in the S tier, since there is one sustainer I would put above her, and I would only put one sustain in the SS tier. But with that being said, we are now moving on to Topaz, and I will be honest, this was very difficult for me, and I'm sure there will be a lot of people who disagree with me, but I need you guys to hear me out. Now remember, we're only considering E0, S0, and this is a tier list of how worthwhile units are to invest into rather than just their power level. And with that in mind, there's only really two teams in which you play Topaz in, and that's with Ratio and Feishao. Now starting off with Ratio at E0, S0, Topaz only provides one debuff, so to get your other debuff you have to rely on Aventurine's ult, or Dr. Ratio's effect res implant and his ultimate, and that's it, other than the speed reduction you can get from his technique, but that only lasts for about one cycle, which means you're looking at around 2 to 3 debuffs on Ratio when his ult isn't up, which won't even guarantee you a follow-up if you only have 2, since that's only an 80% chance. And even when you have 3 or 4 up, that won't max out either his A2 trace or his A6 trace, which give him crit rate and crit damage as well as extra scaling. So honestly, I'd rather play a unit like Mose in Ratio teams if Topaz is E0, S0. And I mean, he's a 4-star, so he's just easier to get. Maybe even possibly someone like a Silverwolf or a Jiaoqiu, since they both give more debuffs as well as more comfort. And now when it comes to Feishao, again, Topaz is very strong for her, but you have both March and Mose as good free-to-play options, and everyone can get an E6 March for free, who isn't too far behind an E0, S0 Topaz. So in my opinion, Topaz isn't the most valuable unit to pull, since she has issues at E0, S0, and both March and Mose are two very good 4-star options. So for that reason, I know it just sounds like I trashed on her, but believe me, I still think she's a pretty damn good unit, which is why I'm putting her in the A tier. But for those reasons, that's why I wouldn't put her in the S tier like many people nowadays suggest. And I mean, if you also think about Ratio and Feishao's best teams that both want Aventurine and Robin, I'd sooner pull for those two than Topaz, and then I'd also rather pull someone like a Ruan Mei for my Firefly Brutal team, or Jiaoqiu for my Acheron team, and then just use a 4-star replacement for Topaz. And so because this is a free-to-play tier list, I would only put Topaz in the A tier, since although she's good, she requires more investment than other units and has viable 4-star replacements, but I do still think she's above the likes of Gepard, Luocha, and Silverwolf in the B tier, which is why I'll put her in the A tier, but she's not S tier for me. Okay, well, that was a long one, but now moving on to Huohuo, I would put her as another S tier sustainer, right next to Xuan. Since, I mean, first of all, she's good at keeping your team healthy thanks to her healing as well as her cleanse. She's got very good offensive support with the ER buff as well as the attack percentage buff. But for me, like I said earlier, there can only be one SS tier support. And first of all, Huohuo isn't as SP positive as other sustainers despite how good she is. And the teams in which she's good in, like Dot, aren't exactly one of the top 3 teams in the game, which I consider to be Firefly, who would rather Galago or Lingsha, Feishao, who would rather Aventurine, and then Acheron, who you're better off playing with a preservation unit like Aventurine, since she wouldn't really benefit from Huohuo's energy gain. However, I would still put Huohuo in the S tier, thanks to her being good in teams like Dot, Yunli, Jingliu, or in Bailu, which although they might not exactly be at the top of the meta, they're still very good teams, which is why I'd put her in the S tier as a very good unit, but not the top of the top. But speaking of the top, we are now at our final version 1 character and one of the best in the entire game, Ruan Mei. I mean, she's just such a versatile buffer, but of course she is mostly known for how good she is in Super Break teams, but then again, you can put her in almost every team and she'll make it better. I've been playing Ruan Mei on the freestyle Lycom meshing cogs, and I've never had a problem with her. Honestly, she's just so busted at. I don't think anyone will argue with her being in the top tier. So I mean, she's basically always going to be either the best or second best buffer in a team. If it's a team where Robin is better in, she can replace Robin and still do a decent job. So yeah, I really don't think anyone will argue against Ruan Mei being in the SS tier. I mean, just think about how broken Super Break is. So yeah, she's going to be our first top tier character. But next up, moving into version 2, we have Black Swan, who I actually did deliberate on for a while whether I wanted to put her in the A tier or the S tier, but in the end I decided to put her in the S tier, and that's mostly because I actually don't think she's as bound to Kafka as Kafka is bound to her. What made me put Black Swan in the S tier is how good she is in pure fiction, especially with units like Acheron, since the Acheron Swan Jiaoqiu team is an unstoppable force in pure fiction, or also the Dot Acheron team, and I mean, she's still a decent partner to Acheron if you pair her with Pela or Jiaoqiu in Memory of Chaos, or you can even use her in Apex Shadow. I mean, even Dot without Acheron can be strong in either Pure Fiction or Apex Shadow, depending on the buffs. So I personally would put her in the S tier for now, and I mean, if Dot gets another support that makes it even better than it already is, that will either solidify her spot here, or maybe even make her go higher depending on how strong that team is. But since that is only hypothetical, I will just about put her in the S tier for now. Now when it comes to the other version 2 character, I would also like to put Sparkle in the S tier. I mean, she's just a very strong support. I mean, she's basically Bronya on steroids, so of course she's going to be good. And she's also quite OP for teams like Bailu or Jingyuan. But the one thing I will say about her is that sometimes Bronya isn't that far behind her, such as in Jingliu or Blade teams, or sometimes Bronya might even be better, like in Brutal teams, thanks to the 100 AV instead of the 50. And also kind of similar to Huohuo, but the teams in which Sparkle is best in aren't exactly at the top of the meta right now, such as the Bailu or Jingyuan teams that I mentioned. So for those reasons, she's in the S tier right now, and she's also just not as universal as the likes of Ruan Mei or Robin, since she's very focused on hypercarry teams. So yeah, I'd put her at the S tier right now, although she's obviously still a very good support. But next up, we have Aventurine, and it is finally time for the top tier sustainer I have been alluding to this entire time. I mean, he's just got it all. Thick, stackable whole team shields that prevent you from basically ever taking damage. He's SP positive since sometimes you only need to use his E like maybe once in a battle, sometimes none. He also deals decent damage thanks to his follow-up, especially if you have someone like Robin on a team or a bunch of debuffs, like if you're playing an Acheron team with Jiaoqiu Pela. He's got the crit damage buff on his ultimate, as well as crowd control prevention with an unconditional 50% effect res increase, so if you have even a little extra on your characters, you'll rarely get debuffed. I mean, he's literally just got it all, and he's part of some of the most meta teams in the game, namely the follow-up teams, or Acheron teams if you're running with the Trend Lycon if you need it. And that is why, to me, he is the best sustain in the game, and if you need to pick one, he would be my choice, because like I said, just very good sustainer, SP positive, decent damage, and is part of the most meta teams in the game, which is why he is in the SS tier. And from one SS character to another. Again, this should be no surprise to round off our SS tier. It's going to be Robin, because I mean, she's just incredible in all game modes. She's best in slot when it comes to follow-up attack teams, and she's very solid in other teams like Dot, or with characters like, for example, Liu. She's also incredible for Hata Himiko teams in Pure Fiction, which are broken. I mean, she just does it all. After getting her, I'd say maybe she's even the best support just because of how OP she makes certain teams, especially after the release of Fei Xiao. But honestly, I don't think it's worth arguing whether she's better or if Ruan Mei is better. They're both undoubtedly in the SS tier. They make some of the most insane teams in the game. They make the game much easier, so I don't think anyone will disagree with Robin or even Ruan Mei being in the SS tier. I would just have them both here. But now it's time for the penultimate character, and that's going to be Jiaoqiu. Now, again, I did have to consider for a while whether I'd be putting him in the S tier or the A tier, kind of similar to Black Swan. But in the end, I just about decided to put him in the S tier, and that's because I actually think he's kind of underrated. First of all, he makes Akron even more insane than she already is. Like, she becomes unstoppable in literally all 3 game modes. But he's not even tied to Akron since, I mean, he just has basically a permanent 35% vulnerability, which is a stronger debuff than Defense Shred, even if it's not by too much. And then he does also give the 15% ult vulnerability, which can be used by characters like Fei Xiao if you're missing a Robin, or if you want to use her for another half. He's absolutely insane in Pure Fiction, very good in Memory of Chaos or Apoc Shadow if you just need a debuffer. And I mean, if you're missing any best in slot character or using them on the other half, then Jiaoqiu will always be a decent alternative because basically everyone benefits from the 35% vulnerability, and those who also deal decent ult damage like Jingliu or Dil will also be able to benefit from the extra 15% vulnerability, which is why I will put him in the S tier, kind of like Black Swan, and I actually think he could even get better with time as more characters release that deal a lot of damage with their ultimate, kind of similar how Swan can increase thanks to Dot. So yeah, I'd just about put Jiaoqiu in the S tier, underrated in my opinion. But with that being said, we are finally on to the most recent support and our final character who released just a couple of days ago, and that's going to be Lingsha. Now, again, I'm going to have to specify this is not a strength tier list, but rather a free-to-play investment tier list, and it's for that reason I would put Lingsha in the A tier, because although she's very, very good, and I mean, she has an incredible kit, first of all, she just faces competition from both Preservation and Abundance units, and of course, her main competition is Gallagher, who is a 4-star that's very easy to obtain, easy to build, and I mean, he's also a Fire Abundance break unit that can cleanse, heal more than enough, and deal big damage, which is why, unfortunately, Lingsha does get bumped down, since although she's very, very strong, she is more of a luxury pull rather than a necessity. In my opinion, if you're building an account, all you really need is a Gallagher, and then you can pick up an Aventurine as your second sustainer. Lingsha is like insane if you pick up even her E1 or her S1. But then again, this is only easier S0. And the reason why she's in the A tier, whereas someone like Huohuo is in the S tier, is because Huohuo has a niche in which she doesn't face much competition, mainly that being Yumni teams and Dot teams, since no one provides the same attack or ER buff as her. But Lingsha, on the other hand, does face strong competition in break teams, just because of how good Gallagher is, who just is more affordable than her and therefore will take away from her value. But yeah, that's it for the list. This is my list. Let me know your thoughts if you agree or disagree. And also I should mention Harmony Trailblazer I see as a 4-star. If I were to rank him, I'd put him in the S tier just because he's free. But like I said, I'm not ranking 4 stars. And I mean, someone like don't even know if you classify him as a DPS or a sustain nowadays. He'd probably just be in the D tier since he doesn't really have a place in the meta at E0, S0, and there's just so many better alternatives. So yeah, if you're gonna ask about those, that would be my thoughts. Now, when it comes to what this list actually means and who should you pull as a free-to-play, if we combine this with the DPS tier list, where I had Firefly and Akron in the top tier, and I would also put Fei Xiao there alongside them nowadays, then I'd say the 3 units you want to pull would be the 3 DPS I just mentioned, alongside Ruan Mei, Robin, and Aventurine. And then maybe you can pick up like a S-tier character like Jiaoqiu if you want to really invest in Akron, or if you don't pick up Akron, then you could go for like a Sparkle if you have a Dill, or if you want to play Kafka or Akron, then you can go for Black Swan. So yeah, that's kind of the logic. My must pulls would be the SS tier characters, and then I would prioritize the S tier supports, which would be most useful to you, and then maybe like any S tier DPS which you want to pick up as well. But that's purely from a meta perspective. End of the day, pull who you like, build teams around them. That's how I personally think is the best way to play. That's how I did it, and that's how I have enjoyed the game most. But yeah, that's my list. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and also what yours would be. Try to keep it civil, but with that being said, hope this helped. See ya.